Yeah. All right.
Hey everyone, I'm Ishan with the Community Engagement Coordinator with HCBN.
And my name is Carl Andrus. I'm the Community Benefits Manager here at the HCBN. We want to welcome everyone to our live stream. Today, we're here to talk a bit about the Hamilton Community Benefits Network and Community Benefits Agreements. So thanks for tuning in. Take us away, Ishan.
Um, so let's start a little bit about the HCBN. We have a lot of members and partners. The Hamilton Community Benefits Network was formed as a community labor coalition back in 2016, 2017 to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the political climate and the announcement of Hamilton as the pilot city for community benefits agreements. So some of our core founding groups, as you can see here, include the Hamilton Brantford Building Trades, Hamilton District Labor Council, Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion, Immigrant Working Center, Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, the YWCA Hamilton. We currently consist of 63 diverse members and partners, including environmental and disability rights groups, neighborhood associations, and not-for-profits, workforce development agencies, unions, and many more interested in advancing community benefit agreements as an institution of social change in the city. We're funded by the dollars of the Hamilton Community Foundation, the Atkinson Foundation, and the United Way of Halton. So we've talked about this a little bit before, but to recap, what exactly are community benefits? So community benefits means additional physical, social, and economic benefits for the local community that are leveraged by dollars already being spent on major infrastructure and land development projects. A CBA is a legally binding and enforceable contract that sets forth specific community benefits for an infrastructure or development project, which benefits have been defined through an inclusive community engagement process. Community benefits can be delivered by way of private CBAs, which would be legal agreements signed between developers and community groups or coalitions, through public procurement, which would be community benefit requirements are included in public requests for proposals, which are RFPs, or through hybrid CBAs, which are multi-party agreements with developers, governments, and community signatories. So in essence, a three-party agreement. Benefits would typically include jobs, apprenticeships, and training targeted to low-income or historically disadvantaged communities. Um, Also, opportunities for local suppliers and or social enterprises, affordable housing, and community amenities, ranging from grocery stores and daycares to park space and public art. So there's been a growing interest in community benefits in Ontario. Stemming from this, CBAs have become increasingly popular. So community benefit agreements are a strategic tool that are used when discussing the development of community wealth, specifically with the purpose of mitigating the impacts of gentrification on the community. Typically, they'll outline specific programmatic and material commitments that are used to develop infrastructure projects through a transparent and inclusive process. In the past, it's been common practice for large economic developments to be built without the consultation of the community that is directly impacted in such projects. So, with the use of CBAs, these projects can be developed while also giving a voice to community members, especially those that have been excluded or marginalized. They often harness community concerns around development and displacement into a net positive environment that creates opportunities for the infrastructure investment to build additional community wealth and are codified in some legally binding agreement or commitment. In the case of government investments, they provide an opportunity to magnify the investment dollars spent on furthering social uplift goals. Specifically, being a formal agreement, they can transform community voice and need into specific solutions, such as unemployment or underemployment, barriers among disadvantaged groups to access construction, technical and professional jobs and or job pathways, lack of affordable housing, or community amenities. It's also important to note that although community benefit agreements might contain similar sounding demands, each one is different and unique to their community, and they're shaped by strong resident engagement and buy-in. So the histories and origins of CBAs. Without spending too much time on the past, it's important to note that CBAs originated in the late 1990s in urban redevelopment practices in the United States. With the redevelopment projects, money was beginning to flow back into the downtown core of cities that previously experienced unemployment and poverty. There was support from local governments, as cities and states often granted public subsidies or tax exemptions in order for developers to more easily and quickly help these areas prosper. Though there were groups who opposed large scale development, there were leaders in the communities who began to emerge in support of these projects, so long as they were implemented through an equitable and inclusive process. They realized the value in these projects and how they could be used to deliver community benefits, often related to affordable housing, community and environmental improvements, and employment opportunities. The previous government passed the Ontario Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, Bill 6, with input from the community and stakeholders like the Toronto Community Benefits Network, which included community benefits requirements for some infrastructure projects in Ontario. 5 pilot projects were selected to test community benefits through project delivery, including the now nearly complete Eglinton Crosstown, Finch West LRT, and Hamilton's LRT project. So, inspired by the success of the TCBN and the opportunity afforded by the Hamilton LRT project, the Hamilton Community Benefits Network was formed to negotiate a Made in Hamilton CBA. So, I'm going to pass it over to Carl to talk a little bit about um, the TCBN and Metrolinx agreements.
So as was mentioned in the previous slide, TCBN was kind of one of the first examples we have in Ontario of the use of a formalized signed community benefits agreements. And they built on the opportunities provided by the previous Ontario government for community benefits with a community benefits framework that was negotiated between the Toronto Community Benefits Network and Metrolinx in 2014. It applies to the Eglinton Crosstown and Finch West LRT projects. It set the standard we hope to replicate here in Hamilton as starting the point for a Made in Hamilton community benefits agreements. And some of those outcomes were a 10% aspirational target for equity-seeking groups and people from historically disadvantaged communities, opportunities in the professional, administrative, and technical trades for equity-seeking groups from those same historically disadvantaged communities, specific outreach programs to reach to youth at risk, and the target communities that they wanted to bring into the project to experience and gain work experience through the project. They also allowed for procurement options for local businesses and social enterprise, including direct to own businesses to target them in order to give them the advantages of perhaps some of the infrastructure dollars being spent. They included some environmental and neighborhood protections and a community benefits working group. Now, this was really important. This meant that every quarter, the community benefits working group met, and that consisted of Metrolinx, the project companies delivering the transit project, and representatives from the TCBN. And they could troubleshoot problems. They could update each other on what was going on the project. TCBN had a stake directly with the project co and Metrolinx in talking about issues that were happening during the project delivery. So it was a really excellent and fundamental gain that community benefits working group existed. So these two projects, as I mentioned, the Eglinton Crosstown and the Finch West LRT, these are some of the outcomes that actually occurred as a course of the project. And they actually exceeded their 10% target in both the apprentice and journey persons and the professional, administrative, and technical positions on the Eglinton Crosstown, and actually got to 212 placements under the community benefit program. And what that means is 212 people who would not normally have had the opportunity to serve in the traditionally male and white dominated unionized building trades. And they were provided with an entryway and training and certification, so that at the end of the process of working on the Eglinton Crosstown project, they were full unionized certified tradespersons and could move on throughout their career with a pension and good benefits and work on other sites. That also extended to the professional, administrative, and technical programs. So we're looking at jobs in engineering, office administration, staff. There was a local procurement that I talked about. Almost $9 million was spent directly on locally racially owned businesses on the corridor where the project was being constructed. A further close to $1 million, about $800,000, was spent on social procurement. That was money that went to social enterprises directly. That is, enterprises that were tailor-made and not-for-profits who did net good. Those quarterly meetings are still going on for both projects, as I said. There was also some of those neighborhood improvements that I talked about at the Eglinton Crosstown, in the preservation of the old Kodak building, and including a community pushback against the use of diesel power for the backup generators, and they switched to electric for the backup power system for the Eglinton Crosstown, so that anytime there was a power issue, a neighborhood wasn't flooded with diesel fumes when the redundant power kicked on. And the Finch West LRT, much newer project, it's still, whereas the Eglinton is almost complete, the Finch West LRT is just getting started, and they've already placed 31 apprentices and 16 professional, administrative, and technicals, and are pushing $3.5 million in local procurement. So those are two of the, and another one of those neighborhood improvements that was really important to talk about was, of course, the donation of land from the operation and maintenance facility, the Finch West LRT, for that for a community arts hub. So Meadowlink actually gave land that was surplus to their project to the City of Toronto for use to build a community space with a rec center, a pool, and that land transfer has been complete, and the City of Toronto is just completing its due diligence on building and applying for funding for that community hub and arts plan. So another signature community benefit agreement was actually signed by the City of Toronto with support from the TCBN, and it was between the City of Toronto and One Toronto Gaming. It was signed back in 2018, and this was for the redevelopment of the Woodbine Casino. And it included very high targets in terms of 20% local hiring. That is to say, 20% of the jobs that occurred on the site would have to occur in the local postal code, including 20% social hiring. So those targets that we talked about in terms of increasing diversity, they included a local training program, a $5 million donation to the City of Toronto to build a childcare facility in the area, operation and access to the community spaces in the hotel and theater for community engagement and opportunities for communities to host shows, plays, use spaces inside the casino. And some of the outcomes you can see from that there are on the screen of where they've managed to exceed or live up to their target quotas, including, you'll look at that, $116 million in direct local procurement in the City of Toronto. That, again, $600,000 in social procurement for social not-for-profit owned businesses. And then, of course, there was a requirement that they also were creating full-time jobs as part of the community benefit agreement. So these wouldn't be part-time temporary jobs that cycle through workers. These would be full-time jobs where a workforce had a career with pension and good pay, and those jobs were guaranteed to people who lived around the casino and in the neighborhood where the casino was built. So the Windsor-Essex or Gordie Community Benefits Coalition worked on the Gordie Howe International Bridge for a community benefits plan that was developed to be implemented both in Windsor-Essex and the Detroit, Michigan side of the project. And it included a $10 million fund for each side of the border for specific neighborhood improvement projects that would be voted on and improved by the two target neighborhoods that they selected for those funds to be spent in. They also included a workforce development and participation strategy, and then, as I said, the neighborhood infrastructure strategy with a $10 million fund. 40% of the 5,360 employment opportunities were local hires to the Windsor-Essex or Detroit area. 190 local businesses were used for their procurement needs. They've so far to date done 210 new pre-apprentice apprenticeships from their marginalized target groups. They're continuing to negotiate over a legacy fund that would continue those neighborhood neighborhood infrastructure investments after the project was reached that could be as much as $50 million. There's constant community engagement over those neighborhood infrastructure projects every year on what would be spent and where in the neighborhoods. And this was actually a project that had no fixed hard targets, unlike some of the other two that we talked about. These were all just commitments by the parties to try and do their absolute best, but they had no fixed targets for any of these outcomes. So the City of Ottawa and the Ottawa Community Benefits Network and a private developer successfully negotiated the municipal memorandum of understanding for the Manor Park Estates neighborhood, which contains 654 rental aging mid-century townhouses that line Brittany Drive off Montreal Road, backing onto the National Capital Commission parkland. In exchange for a new secondary plan that added substantial density zoning, that is to say, from the 654 townhouses, the density would be increased to allow 3,872 units to the area. The developer agreed to a no displacement policy, that every renter would receive a new unit phased throughout construction at or below their current market rate, that a total of 10% of the net new affordable housing units would be created for 20 years. In terms of this, MOU would be binding to future sales. That is to say, they tied the MOU to the land use and secondary plan, so that if a new developer came along to buy that project because the Manor Park Estates weren't able to complete it, this memorandum of understanding would move with the title of the land as a feature of the land sale. So it bound it to future sales. And the developer would enter into a formal community benefits agreement with the Ottawa Community Benefits Network around employment targets for disadvantaged groups to gain access to apprenticeship and employment opportunities from the actual project build itself. So the City of Toronto has two bylaws. They have a social procurement bylaw and a community benefits agreement bylaw. And their social procurement bylaw has two core issues that are really, really neat. And social procurement is a form of community benefit that is often included in community benefit agreements because it drives dollars that are going to be invested into local communities and local businesses. And two of those are the workforce development and the supply chain diversity. So the supply chain diversity is a business strategy that the City of Toronto undertakes, where every department in the City of Toronto, if they're spending between $3,000 and $100,000, can go to a list of pre-approved goods or services suppliers that are not-for-profit businesses or racially or women-owned businesses that have been pre-approved to provide goods for the City of Toronto. So it's a targeted spend on businesses, for example, that on the front line of the pandemic underwent a whole bunch of difficulty. There was also the workforce development requirement that said that as part of the city's for proposal and tenders over $5 million, that they would build a series of hiring demands with the employer in order to increase diversity in the trades and in some other sectors as required. And finally, they adopted a community benefits framework in 2019 that said that on major City of Toronto projects, anywhere the City of Toronto had a lever such as procurement, real estate transaction, or financial incentives for specific sectors, they would use that as an opportunity to create equitable economic opportunities through workforce development, as well as community benefit initiatives driven by the local community. So that meant that if the City of Toronto was going to do like the City of Ottawa did to redevelop Manor Park, with an MOU, that they would try and implement terms and requirements motivated by the community that they were engaging in and where the project was going to take place, to make sure that they were doing their best for whatever that real estate transaction, procurement, rezoning, etc. was, that would provide the maximum community benefit for that community. And then there's the City of Hamilton LRT. Originally, under the previous government, Metrolinx and the province had committed themselves to open dialogue and discussion around what shape and form a Hamilton Community Benefits Agreement would look like. They delegated to City Council, these are some of their slides in front of you here, that they were committed to the process they'd begun with TCBN, and they would commit to a written draft community benefits framework in consultation with community and labor. They committed to undertaking a community benefits liaison plan that would support local employment, local procurement, and procurement from social enterprises. They also committed to a signed apprenticeship plan firm targets as part of the Community Benefits Declaration. In addition, they noted that there would be other benefits that accrue outside the scope of their RFP with the Project Co. At the time, they took steps to include HCBN and introduce us to each of the three BidCo proponents so that we might question them about their community benefits plans. They joined us in listening to our early community conversations with residents to hear what they might want from community benefits agreements. They agreed to early input into station designs, for example, water fountains at LRT stops. Further to their commitments and openness to work with HCBN on a liaison plan and apprenticeship plan, they heard and acknowledged our concerns around boarded up buildings on the corridors. As we heard from residents, this was negatively impacting their lived experience in their homes. They engaged in a $20K pilot project with an additional $5,000 from the Hamilton Community Foundation and undertook a series of pilot art projects on 5 sites. This partnership with HCBN, Metrolinx, the Community Foundation, the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, the Art Gallery of Hamilton, local artists created a series of youth-centered art pieces in the classroom that were displayed on Metrolinx-owned properties. In addition, as part of the project delivery during the previous Hamilton Light Rail project, the government had committed $5.8 million for land procurement, along with a commitment from the Hamilton Community Foundation to match those dollars for an additional $5.8 million. And they were to be used as part of a strategy to replace the lost market affordable housing along the corridor. It's important to note that Metrolinx alone in the property procurement needs displaced around 150 people, taking 61 or more units of deeply affordable market rate rentals off the market. Those rentals with private rents well below average due to long-term occupancy and grandfathered rents. In addition to the units lost by Metrolink property procurement along the corridor, further displacement continues as the market begins to buy up undervalued property along the corridor in anticipation of LRT's developments. I'll turn it over to Ishan for our next slide.
So, as part of the project delivery from the previous government, some conversations started around the number of positions that would be opened through the project delivery and commitments to some affordable housing along the corridor. Along with this, programs and funding became available for training to ready the workforce in target groups for the opportunities that would come from the project delivery. So the HCBN, with its members, the Hamilton Brantford Building Trades and the Immigrant Working Center, undertook a training class to provide skills for newcomers that would be required in the Hamilton LRT. We had 161 participants that took place, and the province put aside $570,000. And eventually 67 of these folks found jobs on other projects since the Hamilton LRT was canceled at that point. And many in the program were also disappointed that they didn't get the chance to help build a new system, but supports and funding were very beneficial to these participants. It's also important to know that making positions available through community benefits agreements with the project company isn't enough. There's many barriers to entry for women, racialized, and Indigenous folks in the trades, so wraparound supports are really key to making sure the positional gains from the project are filled with those that the Cbas seek to help. So let's look at the Hamilton LRT in the present. Currently, the project has not undertaken a request for proposal process. Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario are still deciding the procurement model. There are 2 key commitments so far from the province and the federal government towards community benefits. Both of them are aspirational. One, in the Memorandum of Understanding between the city and Metrolinx, it acknowledges the importance of affordable housing and community benefits and commits to a conversation with key stakeholders. No mention of the community benefits network, however, or following the established path that was pioneered by the TCBN. Nor is there any funding announcement or commitment for use of Metrolinx's owned land for affordable housing. The second commitment being the current government's policy of community employment benefits, which tend to be volunteer and have no firm commitments behind them. There's also the current government's word that affordable housing was important as part of the project delivery. So the current provincial government abandoned the $5.8 million commitment to affordable housing along the Hamilton LRT when the project was terminated, and they've made no firm announcements towards affordable housing along the corridor. They also made announcements that they would abandon a commitment to donate a small piece of land from the operation and maintenance facility for a Jane Finch Community Hub and Performing Arts Center. This month, they announced that they plan to abandon the 10% target negotiated for the two previous LRT projects as well. So, facing public pressure and media shame, they recommitted to the donation of the land for the community hub and promised they would continue diversity policies, but did not include any language around community benefits in the most recent RFP for Ontario Line subway. So, one of the reasons why we have been supporting the LRT, besides looking forward to major improvements in the public transit along the B line over buses and traffic, was that the project would be very transformational. The 14 kilometers of dense, neglected, poverty filled parts of the city would see a huge transformation. And the LRT project is doing exactly what the government had hoped as a shovel ready infrastructure program. It's continuing to fuel a hot development market. Hamilton has planned over 12,000 units or private sector housing going up in towers and developments within 1 kilometer of the line. Furthermore, development is planned with the recent purchase of the aging Eastgate shopping mall and other low density car and parking heavy commercial plazas along the line. Thousands of jobs are being produced from this booming development on top of 6,000 or so expected person years of employment from the project itself. So, as a driver for economic development, the investment is already paying off before shovels are in the ground. And as the project continues, development will only accelerate. But with all this, um, the project land acquisition displaced, as mentioned, around 150 people by Metrolinx alone. The booming investment and development along the corridor is snatching up traditionally affordable housing, affordable market rate units for redevelopment and demolition. As we can see, there's a picture here of an apartment lost for LRT construction. So the affordable housing crisis is skyrocketing. Since the first announcement of LRT, rents have almost doubled in the corridor area. No true numbers exist on how many folks have been displaced, but the homelessness situation is at a peak. Um, there are more tents and encampments forming across the city and tend to be concentrated along the LRT corridor. As developers continue to procure more and more land in the area, they're not only driving the affordable housing crisis and contributing to the displacement, but actively displacing families. It's also making it unaffordable for social and not for profit housing providers to compete. The recent example of the Delta High School being procured for market condominiums over a not for profit developer highlights the challenges of displacement and building affordable housing along this new higher order transit line. So, large scale government infrastructure investments are transformative for the community. The question is, though, transformative for whom? So, community benefit agreements engaged in good faith with community partners. And this process can be an important tool for mitigating the challenges and implications from a project like the Hamilton LRT. And that's the end of the presentation that we have for today. And we want to kind of have a brief discussion on what the implications of the future provincial election might take on the LRT project.
So I can certainly start us out, and one of the things to consider is that the Hamilton LRT project, at this point, with the memorandum of understanding signed and firm commitments from all levels of government, will probably is 99% likely to survive both the coming municipal and provincial elections. At this point, the project is probably not going to be canceled again. It's gotten to a point now, a critical mass of funding and agreements signed, that it would be very difficult for any party at this point to back away from the project. So it will continue. The question is, what kind of support can we count on from the provincial government, who really controls Metrolinx? It's really the Ministry of Transportation that tells Metrolinx and gives Metrolinx its marching orders in terms of how they handle community benefits, how they handle the disposition of surplus land. Metrolinx will try to sell whatever surplus land they have to a developer at the highest bid, just so that they can recoup some of the costs undertaking to develop transit. That's their mandate. Their mandate is not, their mandate is to build the Hamilton Light Rail. Their mandate is not to build affordable housing. So those directions have to come from the government, and they have to come from negotiations with the city of Hamilton. Now, what that looks like, we don't know. So far, as was mentioned in our presentation, we have an aspirational hope that affordable housing may be included, but there's been no hard targets, nothing agreed or signed upon. So we don't know what that's going to look like. And as we move closer and closer to the provincial election, Metrolinx as a government agency will go into a caretaking mode. So they will, just basically say, okay, we can't do anything more other than keep the lights on until a new government's elected, because we don't have our marching orders from the government, and the government could change. This happens, it'll happen in the city of Hamilton when we go into kind of almost a lame duck session of council as October approaches. It's just a natural thing that governments go into caretaking modes around elections, so that bureaucracies don't make grotesque decisions that aren't supported by an unelected government. What does that mean for the Hamilton Light Rail project? We don't know. What does it mean with the latest announcement of funding from the federal government? Was there any specific budgetary items announced around the Hamilton LRT project? There wasn't. So all we have right now is the goodwill and hope, which is why the recent motion that passed City Council that was presented by Councillor Nan, in terms of just asking the city to start investigating what their land use policy is going to be along the LRT corridor. What are they going to need with this new density that we know is coming? Is it going to be parks? We need extra rec centers, new libraries. What are we going to need coming forward, including land for affordable housing along this higher order transit corridor? So what is the city's strategy for the land that they own? Because the land that they own is fairly substantial. The city does have quite a bit of parcels here and there along the LRT corridor and across the city. So what's their strategy? Some of those parcels are really small. They're small parking lots. So does the city have plans to maybe buy an additional lot beside them, or an additional building, in order to get enough of a size of block of land to build an 8 to 10 story affordable housing? What are the partnerships going to look like between the not-for-profit sectors that are already building along the LRT corridor? There's already a few not-for-profit spaces that are really close to them, including the YWCA having their affordable housing building on Ottawa Street, Indwell having some around the Kenilworth station, Kiwanis Homes having some along that corridor as well. So there's already some affordable housing. So that's the other question that we really have to be thinking about as kind of a city, is what happens to the increased pressure along that corridor land use. We know that the LRT will drive up property values. We know that the LRT will cause increased development, increased density. So where there's maybe a one-story corner store or a restaurant or a drive-through, like the A&W, we will see towers, 10, 20, possibly 30-story towers going up on that space with, potentially hundreds of units. So what's going to happen to not-for-profit owned properties along that corridor? Is they maybe churches or community spaces that own land that's now worth a whole lot, and perhaps they're seeing declining congregations. So will they face increased pressure to sell off those lands that used to be community spaces, a church space or a not-for-profit space, and sell those lands because of the increased pressure for development? So there's a whole lot of change that's coming to the corridor, but a whole lot of question marks, and nobody, including our local municipal government, seems to have any firm idea of what that change is going to look like and how we're going to get to that affordable housing that everybody talks about, everybody acknowledges is really important, but nobody seems to have any firm plans underway.
So in the past, we've talked about land banking, And how would that look as a way to mitigate the the developments that would have such a huge impact on not-for-profit and community spaces?
So there's a couple of different land banks models. There's the community land bank or land trusts. The Hamilton Community Land Trust is a relatively new organization and doesn't have a lot of land and faces a lot of institutional challenges in order to get some, same as a lot of other places. But it's a really neat concept in that what a community land trust does is it owns land and pulls that land out of development forever. So its mandate as an organization is to hold that land in trust for affordability. So it may lease that land out for stuff to be built on it, like an affordable housing complex or a Habitat for Humanity home, but retains the title to that land for forever. So that if that house that's on there is resold, the house can only be sold for the value of the house, not the value of the land. So it keeps that house forever an affordable home. So although the folks living in it get to get the equity of the house itself that accrues that they're living in because they own it and they're paying for that house, and they don't get to accrue the value of the land. So maybe when that family leaves that home and moves out, maybe the land trust decides that what would be better on that house would be a fourplex or an eightplex, a larger unit. And so they would maybe go to a not-for-profit provider and be like, well, we own this land. We'd like to lease it to you for the cost of the property tax. Would you like to build an affordable complex on it? Because land is one of the big premiums built. You need a place to build it on, and space is limited, especially with our firm urban boundary. So one of those options that could be available is for something like a community land trust to gain access to some of that land to hold it. The other, of course, is for the city of Hamilton itself, because they're a government organization, is to buy land along the corridor that's commercial or that currently isn't in redevelopment, and just hold that land in its current state and wait until the right opportunity in the market says to put that land back on the market and build affordable housing on it, when they could say, okay, well, what we can do is we can build this particular block of land will accommodate a 15-story tower. That's 140 units. We can afford to keep half of those, 50%, a deep market owned by City Housing Hamilton, and maybe the other 50% a private developer says, well, we're going to turn those into market condominiums. So you get a mixed use building of people of all income levels, but you have your deeply affordable and your mixed use. So you're not ghettoizing people by putting everybody in a single tower who's in low income. You're getting a mix of communities, and that's an option that the city would have just by sitting on land or procuring land now, because we know that the development is only going to continue and the land around LRT stations is scarce. Once it's gone and redeveloped, it will be many decades before that land use changes again. So that's another option that the city has in terms of land banking they could do right now. The other option, of course, too, is the provincial government has had to buy a significant amount of property along the LRT corridor, especially in Ward 3, where areas where they needed to widen the road or needed the width for sidewalk. And as anybody who walks down that main King corridor knows, a lot of buildings jut right to the sidewalk, right to the property line. So in order for Metrolinx to widen the road, unfortunately, they had to take the whole building, because you can't take a property slice off a standing building. You can't just take an eighth of a building off. It just doesn't work. So they had to buy whole buildings. So they're ending up accruing large stacks of land, some of it around LRT station stops, because that's where they really need to do a lot of the road widening and a lot of the land acquisition. So there's an opportunity for Metrolinx, who has all of this land, to really look at it with some policy direction from the province and the city to say, okay, when we turn this land back over to the private developers, we'll either give it to not-for-profit housing providers, or we'll put a 50% affordable housing criteria on it that says that any developer that wants to buy this land will write into the land transfer or the memorandum of understanding, similar to what, something that happened in Ottawa with the Manor Park development, where the province says to the developer, okay, we'll give you this land on faith, but you have to build 50% of the units you build as affordable housing. And then that forces the developer to reach in to talk to the city or a not-for-profit housing provider, because private developers do well with managing not-for-profit housing. So they'd need a partner either in the city or a not-for-profit housing provider to maintain the properties and to decide who needed to go into the space to rent them out, etc. So that is another option that's also available from kind of the land use along the corridor.
All right, thanks, Carl. I think that's a good amount of info to give out for today.
Absolutely.
Thank you to everyone who is tuning in or checking this video out later. Feel free to message any of us if you have any questions on community benefits, or message our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram page. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for tuning in or watching later. We appreciate it and have a great day. Bye now.